Ahoy! Joe Buddy Hambone here, and I'm back again with a brand new coupon code from our friends over at Noble Night Games. This time we got a long one for you. It's Ring of Warmth, and it's good from now all the way through February the 28th, and it will get you 10% off orders of $10 or more at Noble Night Games. That's right, the code's going to last a long time, and it's a long code as well. It's Ring of Warmth to get you 10% off orders of $10 or more at Noble Night Games running through February the 28th. It's a perfect time to get more games after the holiday season, and if you haven't yet, why not check out Noble Knight's trade-in program? I just did it myself. It was super easy, and now I have room on my shelves to put more games. And when I buy those games, I want to buy them from Noble Knight Games. I'm going to use the code Ring of Warmth, and it's running now through February 28th from our friends over at Noble Knight Games.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the founder and publisher of Unwinnable. When I thought today we were going to talk about necromancy, he said, Hambone, it's a family show. Stu Horvath.
I like where you went with that.
Thank you. Well, you said we're going to talk about Neuromancer, and like in my brain, like you said it the other day, and I was like, Neuromancer, and I kept waking up today going, all right, I got to record today. What are we talking about? Necromancy, right? Different kind of party entirely. Stu, why don't you tell our listeners about what Neuromancer is about?
So before I get to that, I have to kind of set the stage for this a little bit about my state of mind going into this book. A couple of years ago, I convinced Daisy, my wife is fairly Catholic and not very into horror. So I was just like, hey, you know what? I got the perfect horror movie for you. It's The Exorcist. You know, the Catholics win in the end.
Not a date movie. I learned that the hard way.
So I convinced her to watch it, and she was, into it because, like, it acknowledged classic. And in terms of our ability to, it's not the scariest movie. There's some harder stuff out there, in the years since. But a funny thing happened when I was watching The Exorcist with my wife. It occurred to me that I had never actually seen The Exorcist.
What?
Yeah.
Hold on. Wait. The Exorcist, and let's be clear for those listening at home, if you haven't seen The Exorcist, this is, for all intents and purposes, not just a perfect horror movie. It's a perfect movie. And it's one that is so ingrained in the American, and I would dare say global consciousness, because the iconic poster with the priest standing outside of the house in the fog, like, you know who you're getting into bed with when you get into bed with The Exorcist. You know what I mean?
Yep. That's sort of the problem, actually.
But it's crazy to me. Like, I have known you forever at this point. I could have sworn you've seen The Exorcist.
I mean, I've seen Exorcist 2 and 3.
Which is a terrible way to start your journey with The Exorcist, mind you. Real quick sidebar. I was working at a call center. I was like 20, just barely 21 at the time. And there was this really lovely girl in the office. And, we had a little bit of a crush on each other. And she kept telling me how much she loves horror movies, right? So one night I was like, hey, let's go out. Let's grab some dinner. The Exorcist is playing down at the AMC, like they had re-released it in theaters. And she's like, yeah. And I was like, this is the greatest horror movie of all time. Like, if you haven't seen it yet, like, let me tell you, you are going to love this movie. And so we go to Applebee's, as it were, because, 21, that's what you do. The Applebee's right next to the movie theater. We had some beers, had some like half price appetizers, dipped over to see The Exorcist. I have never seen a person turn so white and be so afraid at a movie in my entire life. Now, I'm a big old scared cat. If you ever seen a red panda react to being frightened, and they are frightened very easily, there's a gif of it. Just Google red panda scared. That's me in a horror movie. But I'd seen The Exorcist before, no big deal. The girl never went out with me again. And I was like, but I thought you loved horror movies. But apparently she didn't like that kind of horror movie. She liked Scream, which is awesome. She liked what she'd seen of A Nightmare on Elm Street. She liked whatever like the flavor of the month was at that time. I knew who I was getting into bed with when I got into bed with The Exorcist. she was not ready for that kind of party.
Yeah, but like The Exorcist, like as you said, has sort of become part of the cultural fabric where you know a lot about it, obviously, case in point, before you even see it, or if you never see it. It's sort of embarrassing for me. I wrote an essay about this because it was so mortifying, because I've had long arguments and I've written thoughtful things about like the theming of The Exorcist without having seen The Exorcist. It was so like, what happened? It was like Psycho. I knew the ending of Psycho, the big twist, for no particular reason that I could put my finger on long before I saw the film. Just like kids today just are going to know that Luke and Vader are family connection.
Well, because it's so there in our cultural language. And these movies have been dissected to death. Like, so I've actually, a little confession time for me. I've never seen The Godfather. I've not actually seen The God. Everyone's like, how have you not seen The Godfather? It's The Godfather. Because it's a long movie, but if you've taken a film class, if you have, you know, seen any kind of like retrospective on anything film related, like people just talking about it in passing, like I knew what happened. You know, it's like, I didn't see The Passion of the Christ either. I went to Catholic school. I know how it ended. But with The Godfather, it was like, you know, you see the key scenes replayed on spots on TV. It would air on like Channel 5 where they would do the supercut of all three movies. Like, you know, the broad strokes of it enough. And you've seen all the key parts, you know, dissected, played out to death in various different things since they've come out, because these are all classic movies that are very much like, well, this is cinema. The Exorcist is absolutely the same thing. So I can completely understand how you could argue any standpoint on The Exorcist without actually having seen it.
Yeah. Some movies and books, they throw a pebble into the lake and there's like a little bit of a splash and then that's it. And other movies and books, they throw a boulder in and those ripples just keep flashing back, hit the shore and come back and forth. And they just never stop rippling, right?
Yeah.
And Neuromancer is one of those books. Ironically, I was sure that I had read Neuromancer back in college. If I had, I bailed on it after the first couple chapters because I thought I was rereading it a couple weeks ago. And that was the first time I read the book.
Yeah, I call it one of those books like the bottom of the stack books, where you have a stack of books and you intend to read it and you're reading the other books and you can see the spine of Neuromancer or whatever book it is. And you, at the end of the day, like years later, it's like, yeah, I read it. It was in my stack of books that I read. I read all those books, but you didn't read that book.
This paperback has been on my shelves, my various shelves since the 90s.
Yeah.
I just read it. So, but Neuromancer is definitely one of those books where the splash is still splashing. You know, I know we did a book episode a couple episodes ago, and I usually like to space them out a little bit more, but I read this book and I was just like, holy crap, I got to talk about this one. So it is basically the first cyberpunk novel. Of course, D&D is a nice thing. I talk about this fairly frequently, where like role-playing games have a beginning point. You can point to it and say 1974, the release of Dungeons and Dragons. That's the start of role-playing games as a commercial thing. And that's really nice and clear and easy. Cyberpunk, like punk rock, has no clear point of origin, right?
Yeah.
So Neuromancer comes out in 1984. I'm happy. I'm content to call it the first cyberpunk piece of cyberpunk storytelling, because I think it is. There's other stuff that comes before it that really informs it, is playing with the same themes, but it doesn't feel like a thing, a self-conscious thing until Neuromancer, because Neuromancer is 84. You have Blade Runner, I think, at 81 or 82. You have Akira in 81, 82. There's a whole bunch of Philip K. Dick, some Michael Moorcock, some Roger Zelazny. All of these things inform, and even Gibson's own short stories that were collected in Burning Chrome a couple years after Neuromancer all came out before Neuromancer. So like Johnny Mnemonic predates Neuromancer. It actually shares a character. But Neuromancer kind of just like brings all of these threads together in a perfect way and sets the stage for the subgenre of cyberpunk for like years to come. It's like taking a sledgehammer to the brain reading this book, because there's so much recognizable stuff that appears in other things, like The Matrix.
Wow.
The word The Matrix is in this book in 1984, describing basically a shared hallucinogenic virtual reality computer network like the internet. They're describing the thing that's in the movie, and it's called the same thing. Neuromancer just establishes so much of the language of cyberpunk. It's wild to me, just absolutely crazy how much of an effect it just has in the way we think about cyberpunk. So the first three William Gibson novels are loosely called the Sprawl trilogy. They're sort of connected. There's no through line, like they're all discrete stories involve the Sprawl, which is this megalopolis that stretches from New York to Georgia, just one big city with a fast transit system and stuff. But the sprawl, the idea of urban sprawl is, something that you see in Shadowrun. Sprawl Sites, one of the best Shadowrun source books. Molly Millions, who is a character in both Johnny Mnemonic and Neuromancer, is cybernetically enhanced mercenary, referred to explicitly as a street samurai.
My God.
A lot of this stuff goes unexplained in the entire book, never really gets into what the sprawl is in the way that like a 1,000-page fantasy novel is really interested in telling you all the minutia of the world. Gibson doesn't care if you understand. And that actually kind of makes it a difficult book to read. It's really densely written, and he uses a lot of terminology that's really hard to sort of parse at the beginning. Once you're halfway through the book, it picks up speed, and you can kind of, because you've made decisions about these things. For instance, like I said, he really is the first person to describe sort of a virtual reality internet, where you plug something into your brain and you dive into it sort of as a full body hallucination. You do this with something called a deck. He never describes what a deck is. Shadowrun has deckers who use these things, but the idea, all of the hacking classes in like your Cyberpunk and your Shadowrun and all that, they have like this idea of like jacking into the network and using what is usually called a deck. Never describes what a deck is in Neuromancer, but like you kind of have to piece it together. It has maybe some sort of screen. There's cords, possibly one that attaches like there's sort of like an implication that there's electrodes that sort of patch you into this neural network. There's a keyboard, obviously. There must be some sort of display, and it's portable. It's like a laptop, or you could sling it over. But you also get a kind of feeling that it has a bit of heft. It's not like a slim laptop. This thing could probably stop a bullet if you needed to, but you get none of those details explicitly. It's all established over the course of a couple hundred pages, and you kind of pick it up and you piece together what this thing looks like in your head without ever really knowing it.
So I have three thoughts initially. One, a cell phone back in 1984 would have stopped a bullet because they were thin.
It's true. It's true.
Two, the term jacking into the network never stops being funny.
As soon as I said it, I was like, Hamlin's going to make a joke.
I'm jacking into the network. Just on so many levels. And when you think about Shadowrun, Street Samurai, right? And other terms being clearly pulled from this book. And like, I wonder, how do they get away with it? Because if you did that now, if you took a book and it was like, well, this specific person was in this book, like this style of person, and we're going to call it by that name in our game, like an army of lawyers would swarm upon you, like Agent Smith in the Matrix, just replicating and then taking you out the Matrix. But like, how does that work? Because this is clearly like taken. It's not like taking inspiration from the source material. It's actually taking things that were named in the source material and putting it in your game.
So I knew that this was going to come up, and I tried to look for it. I know that Gibson was really sore at Shadowrun for kind of doing that sort of lifting. He did write a post about it on his official site. It has since been taken down, and I couldn't find the substance of that. All I could find was forums talking about it and kind of being like, he's being a jerk. And I don't know the substance of his argument. I do kind of think that there was never any kind of repercussions for Shadowrun, because I think that Gibson, like me, is sort of like ambivalent about copyright holding. But again, I don't know that for sure because I didn't read the substance of his essay.
Because that's a lot that they got out of Neuromancer.
It is. It's no more or less really than Cyberpunk as a subgenre has taken from Neuromancer.
I mean, it's hard because I understand where a person who might not feel as strongly about copyright flexibility, let's just call it copyright flexibility, as William Gibson is. But there's still like the genre becoming the genre and all the inspirato that poured out of Neuromancer. And then like, well, this is a street samurai. You know,
it does feel a little weird to have the specific names used, and not a lot of work is done to sort of reimagine or play off of those themes. I think that the Shadowrun's argument is always going to be like, yeah, we took all of that, but we injected fantasy stuff into it. And that's probably like an okay argument. Like, I still like Shadowrun. I'm not like turning against Shadowrun because I read Neuromancer.
Oh God, no. But it's just on the surface.
Yeah. Whereas
what
like
it
something like
is.
The Matrix does an awful lot of reimagining and repurposing. And Neuromancer is basically a heist novel in which the thing they're heisting is an artificial intelligence, which is super clever and interesting. There's all these themes in the book about what that means, what artificial intelligence is, like should it be let free? Should it be chained? All of these things inform the Matrix, but it's not just Neuromancer with the serial numbers filed off. There's a lot going on in the Matrix as well, that it's in conversation with Neuromancer in a way that like Shadowrun isn't so much. There's like another funny thing is when we first meet the protagonist, he's in, I think he's in China. And he sort of lives in like the slums, and then there's the big city. And in between is like this weird twilight zone that they call Night City, which is, Night City from Cyberpunk. And it's just like, it's right there in print, Night City, over and over and over again for the first couple chapters of the book. And of course, Mike Pondsmith says that there's no way of knowing. He says that he read Neuromancer years later after he had created his own Night City. Probably true. You could look at his Cyberpunk 2013 and really feel the influence of like Damnation Alley and Hardwired and like a different kind of vibe of Cyberpunk. But at the same time, like I always felt like the R. Talsorian Cyberpunk game was like weird because it had such like an obsession with space. And I always felt like space is like for traditional science fiction, and Cyberpunk should stay on like the filthy ground, with the mega corporations and the seedy streets of the neon, right? But Neuromancer, the back third of it is all in space. It manages to still be Cyberpunk in a way that I was just super surprised by how it all works out and plays out. It's a really fantastic book.
Yeah. And again, dear listener, we are not in any way crapping on either game because we're fans. However, this is just more of a conversation of like where things come from and how the sausage is made, as it were.
Oh, yeah. Night and city are two fairly simple and concepts that are easy to staple together like that. Like, even Street Samurai, in the context of the themes that were happening in the 80s with Cyberpunk, I think that Night City with Cyberpunk, the role-playing game, is a much easier thing to sell than Shadowrun's use of Street Samurai. You could probably make the same argument.
Yeah.
And they probably did. But again, that stuff was fought years and years ago on message boards, and I just don't really care enough to dig into that awfulness. I do wish that William Gibson had left that post up on his site, because I'd love to read it. If somebody does know the substance of it or has a copy, please send it to me, because I'd really enjoy reading it.
Because internet lives forever. Someone's got screen grab.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing gets deleted off the internet.
Nope.
Couple other things. It is, like I said, densely written. Gibson has what I would call a sort of wonderful lyrical quality, which I felt was sort of surprising considering how gritty Cyberpunk generally is portrayed. The book is gritty, is pretty frank about drug use and sex and violence. But as I said, he writes the hell out of it. I felt just through reading it that it reminded me a bit of William Burroughs and the approach to language taken by many other beats. And that was borne out when I was reading up on Gibson. He was very much inspired by Burroughs. So there's like a not nearly as dense or as difficult to read as Burroughs, but there's sort of like a vibrations there going on. The first line, which I will read to you, is fabulous, famous, totally should be, you should know at least the first line, which is, "The sky above the port was the color of television tuned to a dead channel."
Wow.
Like, fuck, man. I wish I could write a line that good. Like,
yeah, please.
Talk about opening lines for novels, all-timer.
See, here's the thing. I will tell you, honest to God, that's how you know you definitely didn't read this book until now, because I guarantee if you had opened the book and you had read that one line, you never would have put the thing down.
It does a really good job for the first two chapters of making you want to put the book down. It has its own rhythm that is very different from a lot of other. I'm not really used to science fiction in general. I don't read a lot of it, but even like I had just come off of Dune Messiah and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I reread that, and coming off of those two books, it was really kind of like a car crash. But like I said, after you get through a couple chapters, you get the pace of it and the rhythm of it. After that, I tore through it pretty fast. He's asking you to do the world building for him in a way that's really interesting and kind of collaborative. So that really slows down and makes the reading a bit more challenging than your average sci-fi novel. Funny thing, though, And this is probably the last thing I have to say, I was having TV problems whilst reading this. It occurred to me that when to a dead channel, for me and Hambone being of a certain age, like what color is that?
Yeah, I mean, it's like a blue. You know,
Now
like
it's a blue.
In my brain, though, it's like a blue or a gray. It's the color almost of like gray industrial carpet with like white specks.
I like that. Yeah, for me, it's sort of like that luminous gray, that thick screen glass, and it has like a hint of light in it, even if it's off. And then there's like the static. Like we know what static on a station that doesn't exist looks like. But
Right.
now you can't see static. There's no such thing as tuning to static on the TV anymore. Now you get bright blue.
Yeah.
It struck me as kind of funny that he starts it off being like, this place is awful and gray. But like, if my kid reads this 10 years from now, he's going to think that he's talking about a really bright blue sky.
It's funny that you say it like that because, like, you know, I initially answered blue about a minute ago, but like in my brain, like, it's funny how it kind of mutates over time what the idea of certain things are and the way certain things look, you know, because it did eventually like go from gray to kind of blue once you got to like the bigger 27-inch CRT TVs, and then kind of migrated from there up until like the absolute like hideous blue that it is now. And it is a hideous blue. It's a blue that you would like never paint your house. It's a blue you would never paint your car or room for that matter. But the grayness and the ambiance that you used to get from those dead channels, it was like something special and something spooky. Now the only place to find it is like an Instagram filter. You know, if you want to get that, like, you got to turn that camera facing your face and do some stuff. But yeah, that's cool, man. Like everything that you're describing about this book feels like cool. That's like a vibe that I'm really digging. I'm probably never going to read this book. Let's be real. It's me, but like, I like the idea of it. You're selling me on the idea.
It's fantastic. But there's a second part to the TV thing. Later in the book, Case runs into this weird couple, and she's a bit of a photographer. He mentions that she has Cibachromes taped to the window of their hotel room. And like, as a modern reader, I bet that sounds really weird and high tech, right? Cibachrome. What the hell is a Cibachrome, right? Do you know what a Cibachrome is, Hambone?
Isn't it that like beautiful filter that they put on pictures and put in cameras to make everything like feel like Portugal and falling in love in the fall?
Sort of. Cibachrome is actually an archaic photographic chemical process by which you can print positives. Most photographs are printed off of negatives, and that requires a certain kind of chemistry. Ciba, you could print from a slide. Remember slide transparencies?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you could print in color on, positive to positive instead of negative to positive. And the chemistry smelled real bad. But yeah, totally. It's defunct now. You can't get the paper. I'm pretty sure that the chemistry is hard to come by. And there's not a whole bunch of people working with Cibachrome. But it struck me as funny because it's like, in the context of the book, Cibachrome, because everything else is sort of like sci-fi and weird. So like Cibachrome is actually something as somebody who I printed Cibachrome, it was terrible. I hated it when I was at photography school. But I knew that was an artifact of the past that just sounds sort of amusingly sci-fi in the context of the book. And there you have it.
I love it. So, I mean, where do we go from here? Do you have any final thoughts on Neuromancer?
I think that if you have any interest in cyberpunk, you should read it. It's a really clarifying read in terms of just kind of understanding the genre. I thought that I had a pretty good handle on cyberpunk, and this really sort of opened my eyes to not just what it is, but like the potentials that have kind of both been fulfilled and left unfulfilled. Like I always sort of like, I mean, steampunk is worse, but I always sort of like turned up my nose at steampunk. I can't take it seriously. And part of me never really took cyberpunk seriously because anytime you put punk on the end of something, I just like, oh God, that's like that punk is doing so much work, right?
Yeah.
I just didn't understand it. This really made me reevaluate. Like, I don't think of the Matrix as cyberpunk, but it really is. Stuff like that. I think that reading it is an exercise in sort of rediscovering or discovering and falling in love with cyberpunk as a genre.
That's cool, man. Like I said, I probably wanted to read in the book, but I like the way you described it. And this was another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you?
They could find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG. Posting photos on like an interconnected network is sort of cyberpunk. I don't know. I don't have any real cyberpunk stuff coming up in 2022. You have to wait till 2023.
Very cool. You can find me on the Twitter and on Instagram at John McGuire RPG. I'm posting more because I have things to promote. So if you're already going to be jacking into the internet, why not stop over at Exalted Funeral and pick up my book, Rocket to Russia. If you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe, because your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. And if you really like the show, why not become a patron? Patreon.com/vintagerepg. You get early release episodes. You get a behind-the-scenes look at Stu's book, still tentatively titled Experience Points. You get a behind-the-scenes look at my RPG 3-2-1 action. You get a lot more, including a killer Discord community that we'd love for you to be a part of. Patreon.com/vintagerepg. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.